taking out my headphones probably saved me. When I was 16 or 17, I was coming home to Brooklyn from a movie in Manhattan with my friends. I was the only one who lived in BK, so I walked home from the train alone. I was used to being out late by myself. I had a midnight curfew, but I frequently broke it because I thought nothing bad would ever happen to me, despite an uptick of rapes and assaults in our neighborhood at the time. This night, however, I was slated to get home on time for once. It was the summer after I graduated high school, and I was feeling amazing. I'd had a little to drink and a little to smoke, and I felt like I was on top of the world. It was so hot out. I remember that I was wearing this long, sheer cape thing, with a very tight and revealing little dress underneath. Because of my fun little outfit, I was feeling myself, and being so stupid, taking selfies while I walked down the dark streets, and listening to music with both headphones in, not paying any attention to my surroundings. I think I even sang as I walked. I got to my building after finishing my 10-minute walk from the train, and walked up the steps to our apartment. We lived in a brownstone with apartments in it, and ours was on the 3rd floor. We had a gate at the bottom of the steps, separating us from the sidewalk. I pulled out my headphones and began to fumble with my keys at the top of the steps. Just as I had found the correct key, still humming to myself, and thinking about my great night, I heard the latch on the gate clink as if it were being opened. I turned around, and I saw a man standing at the gate, staring up at me. He was young, probably early 20s, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood up, covering part of his face. But I could see his eyes, and immediately I knew something was off because of how blank, yet nervous, his expression was. One hand was on the handle of the gate, as if he were about to open it completely, but stopped once I turned around. Somehow, my fight or flight instinct didn't kick in yet. It was probably the alcohol. I cautiously called down, "Can I help you?" and he didn't respond. I looked him over more closely, and realized then that his other hand, the one not on the gate, was moving. Fast. Low. Near his waist. I registered that he was touching himself, gasped, and within milliseconds, he was sprinting up the stairs behind me, reaching out his hand to grab me. My brain clicked into place, and I started screaming at the top of my lungs, as I jammed my key into the door and slammed it behind me. I ran up the stairs to my apartment screaming for my dad, not even stopping to make sure the door was locked, thinking that if he followed me upstairs, he'd soon be met by my very tall father, and our very loud dogs, who slept in the bedroom right next to our apartment door. As I looked over my shoulder, while tearing my way upstairs, I saw his face pressed up against the glass window, still watching me, but now his eyes were furious. I ran into our apartment, still screaming to my parents to call the police. My dad went downstairs and looked around, but he was gone. The police came after my mom called, and came upstairs to take my statement so they could make their report. The 2 cops who showed up asked me to describe him. I did, and they said they'd cruise around looking for him, and regardless of if he was found, a detective would call me soon to make a more detailed report. They never called me. There were many more rapes and assaults that continued to take place in my neighborhood for the rest of the summer. I shudder every time I think about what would have happened if I hadn't taken out my headphones before I began unlocking my door. I don't know how long he was following me for, and as far as I know, he was never caught. From that point on, for those last few weeks before I left for college, I would call my dad and make him meet me at the train station so he could walk me home safely. Now, as an adult, I am far more cautious than I was as a teenager. I am always extra aware of my surroundings, especially at night, and I don't look at my phone while I walk home. I'll never get the image of his blank stare as he lunged towards me out of my head. I will never forget the feeling in the pit of my stomach as I realized that he followed me home, watching me and touching himself, and was now waiting to strike. It was like being a deer realizing it's being stalked by a tiger, because the tiger accidentally stepped on a twig and gave itself away right before it could pounce on its prey. Fake pizza guy at my door. This happened back when I was 17 and living in a small rural village. I had been at a friend's all evening watching films and chilling, and I left to go home around 11 p.m. It was quite a long walk back to mine, as she lived on the outskirts of the village down some back roads. I felt relatively safe as when it got to a certain time of night, it was quiet. You wouldn't bump into anybody, and there would hardly be any cars on the roads, especially at that late hour. It was weirdly peaceful. Where I lived was a large avenue with 2 big blocks of houses, like 2 big circles that you would get to after following a small dark road that consisted of a few large old houses and a vicarage. As I am passing the vicarage, I see this little beat-up red Nissan Micra coming towards me. The closer it gets, the more it slows down, and the guy is nearly breaking his neck trying to look at me. I mean, there was nothing subtle about it. It nearly came to a full stop as it drew alongside me, and I started to panic. There was not another soul about, just me and this strange guy. I was determined not to get myself in a tiz, so I picked up the pace and refused to look at him. As far as I know, he drove off. I continue walking home, which was literally a 5-minute straight line from there, and I kept listening out for a car engine, and was vigilant of any headlights creeping up behind me. I heard nothing, and saw nothing, so I breathed a sigh of relief, as I could now see my house. I walked in and locked the door, and saw my mom stood in the living room chatting on the phone. I'm trying to interrupt her conversation, telling her about the weird guy in the red car, when for some reason she goes to the front window and peeks through the curtain, and she takes the phone from her ear and says, "What, that car?" This is all in a minute since walking through the door, and I'm thinking to myself, it can't be him, because if he had followed me I would have heard the car. Before I even get a chance to look for myself, there is a knock at the front door, so I go and answer it, only pulling it open a few inches, and there is this guy stood there, empty-handed, wearing like a baseball cap. It was the same guy, the same car, and I'm just like, what the fuck? I say, "Can I help you? Did you order a pizza?" He asks me, and I'm like, "No, I think you have the wrong house." Taking a step towards me, he says again, in a not fucking around kind of tone, "No." I said, "Did you order a pizza?" Before I reply, my mom has come up behind me, opened the door fully and says, "Is there a problem?" This causes him to back up, mumbling I must have the wrong address before he gets in his car and takes off. Sure to say, we were both a bit spooked, and made sure everywhere was locked up properly. So to the stealthy alleged pizza guy who stalked me home, let's not meet. Encounter on the Oregon coast. It was the spring after I graduated college. I'm a 22-year-old female, and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, so I decided to take a pause, and ride my bike down the coast from Canada to Mexico. I was pretty nervous to be going by myself, but for the majority of the time, I felt safe. Halfway through, or so, I got pretty comfortable with sleeping alone in fairly empty campsites, parks, etc. There were even some stretches on the trip where I rode with other bike tourists. This one encounter, however, brought my guard back up for the remainder of my trip. I was halfway down the Oregon coast and was a mile or so out from the campground I had planned to stay for the night. There was this notable, yellow vintage Ferrari car that had passed me, headed in the opposite direction. When I pulled into the campground, I stopped at the information board to look at the map and fees. As I'm sitting there, I see the yellow car coming down the road, and it stops where I am. This older guy, in his late 50s, early 60s, gets out and starts looking at the board with me. He's friendly, and seems completely normal, charismatic even. He's asking me about my trip, and starts mentioning how he's from the area, but has never checked out this campground. At this point I'm still pretty naive, as there's plenty of nice people I've met on the trip that chat me up, and ask me about the bike tour. He's talking to me, and getting closer, and this part is what starts to make me uneasy. He would repeatedly reach out his hand to shake mine, like he was about to leave, but every time he shook my hand, he would grab my forearm with his other hand and do this weird gasp laugh thing. The way he did it looked insane, and the arm grasp was very firm. It sent shivers down my spine. Then he dives into another topic, and repeats this freaky handshake, maybe 2 more times, in between. I realize that I'm completely out of sight from anyone in the campground, have no phone service, and I'm now very close to him, in his open car door. There's a knot in my stomach, I'm on the verge of tears, and my voice is shaking with every response. At the time, I didn't even know why, but something felt very off about him. I finally speak up loud, hoping someone can hear me, and tell him I got to get going, run to my bike, and speed to the campground. When I get there, I don't even try to find the hike and bike spots, and just throw tent down directly across from the camp host. Again, I had a lot of encounters with random strangers at this point, but none of them terrified me like this one did. I fought with the idea that he was probably just an overly friendly guy, but the fact he would repeatedly grab my arm and laugh was frightening. All in all, most people I met were very sweet, and it made me very trusting of others. Even if he was harmless, his actions were a good reminder that I had to be mindful of my vulnerable situation, and be more alert. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I will see you next time on The Dark Side of My Room.